When you think about big moments in economic history, like really pivotal shifts, it's hard to ignore what happened in Chile.
The Chicago Boys, right.
Exactly.
It's one of those stories that grabs you, gets right into that knotty intersection of economics and politics and history.
Totally. And it's a story with no easy answers, which, just makes it even more interesting to unpack.
Absolutely. What happened in Chile, it still sparks debate, even today.
Yeah, for sure. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive, to really get into the nitty-gritty. We're digging into this book, The Chile Project. It's called The Story of the Chicago Boys and the Downfall of Neoliberalism. A mouthful, I know. But it really gets into this group, their reforms, and honestly, the long shadow they still cast.
I mean, you can't talk about free market economics without at least touching on the Chicago Boys in Chile.
Right, it's like Econ 101 stuff.
Exactly.
And I always find that a good story, a good anecdote, is the best way to kick things off.
Yeah.
So picture this. 1975, Milton Friedman, the free market guru himself, he goes to Chile. And who does he meet with? Augusto Pinochet, the dictator.
Wow, talk about a loaded image, right? I mean, Friedman and Pinochet.
I know, it just kind of grabs you, doesn't it?
It speaks volumes about how controversial this whole thing was from the get-go.
Oh, absolutely. So Friedman's there, advising on the Chilean economy, which was a mess at the time. And he's all about this shock treatment approach, right? Rapid privatization, deregulation, basically. The opposite of what a lot of people thought was needed back then.
And you can imagine how that went over with some of Chile's business elite. I mean, these are folks used to a pretty heavy government hand in the economy.
Oh, for sure. I bet there were some panicked conversations happening behind closed doors.
Definitely. But here's the thing that a lot of people miss. This wasn't like an immediate consequence of the coup. Pinochet was already in power 2 years by this point.
Oh, right.
The economy was tanking. Friedman's visit, it was a calculated move by the regime. They knew what they were signaling.
A complete 180 on economic policy.
Exactly.
And that's where the Chicago Boys come in.
Right.
But it wasn't like they were just like this foreign entity parachuted in.
Right. It's not like some American intervention,
No, exactly. And that's what's so fascinating. These were Chilean economists. They'd studied under Friedman at the University of Chicago, came back with these radical ideas.
They were academics, writing columns, teaching, but largely ignored by, the establishment at the time.
Until Pinochet.
It's such an interesting dynamic, like a homegrown intellectual movement, right?
Yeah.
And then suddenly, they've got the ear of a dictator.
And a chance to put their theories into practice.
Exactly. And here's the other part that gets me. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing either.
Oh, you mean the whole El Ladrillo thing?
Yes. The brick.
Years before the coup, while Allende is still in power, they're already crafting this secret economic plan.
It was their playbook, a blueprint for a totally different Chile, economically speaking. And get this, most of the economists involved, they didn't even know who'd requested it.
It's like something out of a spy movie. All these economists working on this secret plan, completely in the dark about who's pulling the strings.
Totally.
Right.
And talk about intrigue, right?
So who did ask for it? Who commissioned this mysterious brick?
A group of Navy officers. They were already fed up with Allende, with his socialist policies. They saw this brick, this plan, as a potential way out, a way to create a different kind of Chile, a Chile with a market-driven economy.
So they saw the Chicago Boys as the ones to build this. So you got this group, right, the Chicago Boys, armed with their radical plan, just kind of waiting in the wings, and then, boom, 1973, the coup.
Yeah, Pinochet seizes power.
And it's a dark time, violence, human rights abuses. You can't talk about this period without acknowledging that.
Absolutely. It's inseparable from the economic story. It's what makes the whole thing so, ethically complicated.
For sure. But in terms of the economics, this is where the Chicago Boys finally get their shot, right?
Yeah.
Pinochet basically hands them the keys to the economy.
It's go time for El Ladrillo. Their blueprint becomes reality.
And how did that actually play out? I mean, did they ease into it or?
Oh, no, they did not ease into anything. We're talking sweeping reforms, like overnight. Privatization, deregulation, slashing government spending, total upheaval.
Wow. Just thinking about that now, it's like dizzying,
It was a complete 180. One of the biggest things was, of course, privatizing all those state-owned companies, hundreds of them.
I bet that had a huge ripple effect.
Yeah.
That's got to be impacting everyday Chileans.
Right.
What did the Chile Project say about how that actually went down?
Oh, it gets into it. We're talking essential industries, right?
Yeah.
Utilities, transportation, even healthcare, all sold off to private companies.
Wow.
And the Chicago boys, their argument was that this would make things more efficient, lower prices, that kind of thing.
Okay, and did it.
Well, it's complicated. Some sectors definitely thrived. But for a lot of everyday Chileans, it meant job losses, rising costs.
It's fascinating to me how, like, this theoretical idea, right?
Right.
Privatization, it ends up having such a real, tangible impact on people's lives.
Absolutely.
Did the book give any specific examples of that?
Oh, yeah, tons. One that sticks out is what they did with Social Security. They completely overhauled it, got rid of the public system, and replaced it with private retirement accounts.
Wow, that's a big change.
Huge. And again, it created opportunities for some. You could invest your money, try to grow it. But it also meant more risk. And for a lot of people, it made the gap between the haves and the have-nots even bigger.
So, I mean, the big question is, did this experiment work? Did Chile become this, like, free market paradise?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, like with most things, is complicated.
Okay, walk me through it.
So Chile's economy, it did see growth in the 80s. No doubt about that. Inflation went down, foreign investment went up. Certain sectors, like I said, did really well. But,
There's always a but.
right, it came at a cost, a social cost.
The human cost of progress, as they say.
Yeah, and the book doesn't shy away from that at all. Inequality soared during this time. The gap between rich and poor, it just got wider and wider. The Chicago boys, they argued that a rising tide lifts all boats, but...
Clearly, not all boats were lifted equally.
Exactly, and it's in this context that things take a turn.
Oh. What happened?
1982, Chile's hit with this massive economic crisis.
Oh, wow. So almost like the system backfired.
In a way, it was a perfect storm, really. Global recession, copper prices tanked, which was bad news for Chile, and then some internal mistakes were made, policy-wise.
So even the Chicago boys, with their free market idealism, they weren't immune to, like, real-world economic forces.
No one is. And this is where it gets interesting, because this crisis, it forced them to rethink some of their core beliefs. I mean, even the most die-hard advocates of this shock treatment approach, they had to acknowledge that, okay, maybe the model isn't perfect.
Interesting. So what did they do?
Well, they had to make changes, right? They realized that even a free market, it needs some guardrails, some safety nets to protect people.
So did they actually change their approach? I mean, long-term, did they become less radical?
That's a great question, because even though they had to adapt, even though they had to make concessions, the core of what they put in place, those core reforms, they largely stayed.
Yeah.
Even after democracy returned in the 90s.
Wild. Right. Like, even with everything that happened, the Chicago boys' influence, it's still there.
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't just disappear overnight. And that's what makes this next chapter so interesting. You know, the 90s, democracy returns to Chile.
Right.
You've got these new governments, the concertation governments, and they're center-left.
So more moderate.
Yeah. And you'd think, okay, they're going to dismantle all these free market reforms, right? Get rid of the Chicago boys' legacy once and for all.
Makes sense.
But they don't.
They don't. Why not? I mean, if it was so controversial, if people were so against it.
Well, it's partly pragmatic. By then, Chile's economy is completely integrated into the global market.
So it would have been messy to, like, completely reverse course.
Exactly. But it also seems like there was a recognition that, you know, some things, they had worked. The economy had grown.
So it wasn't all bad.
Right. It's more nuanced than that. And that's how the Chile Project describes it, actually, inclusive neoliberalism.
Inclusive neoliberalism. That sounds like an oxymoron.
Right. But that's what they were going for. Keep the economic stability, but also, like, expand social programs, invest in education, try to tackle the inequality.
So find a middle ground.
Exactly.
Easier said than done, I'm sure. So did it work? Did they actually find that balance?
That is the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. And honestly, I'm not sure there's an easy answer.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, on paper, Chile made huge strides, economically speaking.
Became a model, even.
Right. Other countries looking at Chile saying, okay, this is how you liberalize an economy. And you knew there was going to be a but the Chile Project makes it clear. The social costs, it never really went away.
And that all explodes with the 2019 protests, right?
Yeah.
It was huge. The whole world was watching.
Yeah. And it wasn't just about, like, one specific policy or anything. It was decades of frustration, this sense that the system, it worked for some, but not for everyone.
Which, let's be real, kind of goes back to the whole Chicago boys experiment in the first place, right?
Totally. And that's how the book frames it, actually, like a reckoning. Like, Chile was finally confronting this ghost of its economic past.
It's like all these abstract economic theories, they finally collided with, like, people's actual lived experiences.
Exactly. And that's important, right? Economic policies, they're not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
They affect real people.
Yes. And we have to remember that. We have to think about the long-term consequences, not just like what's good for the GDP this quarter.
Right, right. So where does that leave Chile now? It feels like they're at a crossroads.
They are. I mean, one of the biggest outcomes of those 2019 protests, it was this call for a new constitution.
Oh, wow. To actually address these issues.
Yeah, address the inequality, create a more just system. It's a long process, but it shows you where people's heads are at.
Yeah, well, it really makes you think, can you have progress, real economic progress, without leaving people behind?
The million-dollar question, right. And it's not just a question for Chile. It's something we all have to grapple with, no matter where we live, what system we live under.
Absolutely. Well, I'd say we've definitely unpacked a lot here. The Chicago Boys, their legacy in Chile, it's a complicated story.
To say the least.
But for folks like us who are drawn to these kind of, like, naughty historical moments, what would you say is the key takeaway?
That economics, it's never just about economics. You can't separate it from politics, from social structures, from people's lives. And if we want to build a better world, a fairer world, we have to understand that. We have to understand those connections.
Well said. The Chicago Boys, Chile, it's a good reminder that there's always a human element to these stories. And it's a story that's still being written, which, I always find fascinating.